Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Today, heavy fighting continues. Some of the most heaviest and vicious fighting continues to take place running near Bakhmut. Again, both sides are reporting incredibly heavy fighting taking place within the vicinity of Bakhmut, both to the north and south and center of the area near Bakhmut, as does heavy fighting continue to take place near Kreminna and west of Lysychansk. So as we know, Russian forces have pulled out of the western bank of the Dnieper River. They have taken that 20,000 or so unit force that existed and operated on the western bank of the Dnieper River and have since pulled those forces to the eastern bank, in all probability to be redistributed in other areas, most likely in the direction towards Bakhmut and then possibly Zaporizhia. So the question I think a lot of people are asking at this point, is it still possible for Russia to win this? And then what does winning mean for Russia? Well, at this point, I think anything less than taking Kharkov and quite possibly taking the eastern bank of the Dnieper River would suffice as a win for the Russian Federation. I guess it could be argued, and it will probably be argued, if the outcome is in fact that Russia remains control of a land corridor from the Donbass to Crimea. And that will ultimately be argued within the Russian circles if they perceive that as a win or not. But as we look at the reasons for the conflict, the reasons Russia moved into Ukraine, I think ultimately, if the Russians have not achieved certain objectives, such as seizing control of all territory east of the Dnieper River, then in all likelihood, we will see, upon the ending of said conflict, we will see Ukraine being vastly rearmed. And at the end of the day, the Ukrainians will become, in fact, a de facto member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You will see the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian armed forces, start to look much like a NATO force. And it's already starting to do that. We will probably see the rebuilding of the Ukrainian Air Force that, in all probability, will become much more lethal than in its present state. And again, this is all hypothetical, but the question remains, how does Russia win this current conflict? And again, I only see one real way right now for the Russians to do that. At the start of this conflict, we saw the Russians deploy itself in these battalion tactical groups. And I think and I believe that if the Russian Air Force would have been much more effective, especially in its ability to interdict Ukrainian forces on the move, then in all probability, again, the Russians would have been much more successful in some of its operations. The battalion tactical group is proving to be very much unsuccessful in the continuation of this conflict. The whole concept of taking a armored division or a motorized rifle division. Let's take the 4th Tank Division, for instance, based outside of Moscow. And out of that 4th Tank Division, which normally would have between 10 and 12,000 personnel, to then subdivide that into essentially 3 battalion tactical groups, 3 reinforced battalion tactical groups made up of, in large part, of professional soldiers, and leaving much of the remainder of the 4th Tank Division behind, and just operating with those professional personnel that have been accumulated into those 3 battalion tactical groups. And we're finding out now that, especially in terms of, let's say, the 4th Tank Division, that that was one of the reasons we're seeing some of the things happen to Russian forces. In one reported instance, one of these battalion tactical groups was almost made up entirely of tanks, with just one company, an understrength company at that, of infantry support. So it's going to be very, very difficult, and it was very difficult, obviously, for the Russians to wage the kind of war that we are seeing now by utilizing the battalion tactical group. In all probability, the Russians should have deployed as full division formations. But because of the politics of war, and again, this is where the politician creates an atmosphere where ultimately the military is defeated. And that's what happened in this case. The Kremlin made the decision, whether you say it's Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, what have you, they made the decision, at least initially, not to deploy conscript forces into Ukraine. And that disallowed the ability of Russian forces to deploy, say, the entirety of the 4th Tank Division, the 4th Armored Division, into Ukraine. Instead, they subdivided them into battalion tactical groups, and it just wasn't enough. Especially with the type of war that we're seeing now. Now again, if, and I lay this at the feet of the Russian Air Force, if the Russian Air Force would have performed quite a bit better than what we have seen, then obviously that may have changed things in regards to the use of the battalion tactical group. But that hasn't happened. So again, so how does Russia win this? Well, the only way that I see it currently, a couple of different things are going to happen. First, obviously, the Russians are going to have to mobilize. They are going to have to increase the size of their military capacity. Simple fact. Next is the Russians are going to have to focus on moving up the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, most likely here at Zaporizhia. They're going to have to launch offensive operations on just the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, moving in a north and then by northwesterly direction, cutting off Ukrainian access, or the ability of the Ukrainian forces to supply itself from the western bank to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Now, is that an operation that is two-pronged, that starts in Zaporizhia and then is also at the same time prosecuted through Chernihiv, and both forces eventually meet somewhere in the center? Possibly. But right now, the way things are going, that's the only way I see a successful outcome for the Russians. This battering away along this eastern front, east of Izum now, east of Kramatorsk, near Donetsk, and attacking along this frontal line by the Russians, I just don't believe at this point is going to work. The Russians are going to have to maneuver. They're going to have to mass forces, and they're going to have to figure out a way to cut off Ukraine's ability to transport forces to the eastern bank. Now, is that going to happen? Difficult to say. We've heard talk that there could be a summer offensive or a spring offensive planned. I don't believe it'll be a spring offensive. I think more likely than not it'll be a late summer offensive if that occurs. But ultimately, given Ukrainian mobilization efforts and the ability of Ukraine to vastly expand its armed forces, the most plausible route for a Russian win is to create a defensive line running from north to south along the Dnieper River. And then ultimately that would eventually lead to the encirclement of a large amount of Ukrainian forces in the east. Now I get it, it's a tall ask, and obviously taking all of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River is probably something not even on the radar right now, given what's happened. The idea that Russia is looking anything outside of taking territory outside of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River isn't going to happen right now. Once they lost their foothold on the western bank of the Dnieper River, that all ended. Any concept of western bank of the Dnieper River offensive operations is just not on the table right now. Not even close to the table. But right now the Russians need to look at, can we mobilize? Can we generate enough force to launch offensive operations near Zaporizhia, move up the eastern bank of the Dnieper River near Zaporizhia, and most likely as well near Chernihiv through Belarus, south of Gomel, launch renewed operations again near Sumy, Kharkov, other areas. I mean, again, this is going to be a grand scope operation, much bigger than what we're seeing right now. But ultimately, that's the only way that Russia is going to be able to win this. But then again, it's what is your definition of win? Look, I mean, the Kremlin could say, well, the operation's over. We have, quote unquote, denazified Ukraine, which means we have reduced Ukrainian force capacity. But that would simply not be true. And in all probability, you're going to see a Ukrainian military a year, 2 years from now, post-war, that is going to be reinforced with much more Western equipment. Then it would even be more difficult for Russia to launch that operation. So the concept that Russia hits the pause button, rebuilds, quote unquote, rebuilds its military, and then launches a second round of fighting at a later date, in all probability, that's just not going to work. Because the Ukrainians, again, are going to rearm. And they're going to be in a much better position in terms of military capability than they were even at the start of this conflict. Tough situation. Very tough situation for the Russians right now. But we will see what happens. We will continue to report, and we will have more information as we get that information. And we will continue to analyze on what we're seeing on the ground. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.